The rain had begun before the bells, as if London itself wished to weep ahead of the hour. It slid from slate roofs and darkened the hems of gowns, pooled in the ruts of the street, and turned every mirror of glass into a trembling thing. Within the vaulted nave of St. Aldrich's, candles burned with a chastened light, and the scent of damp wool and crushed flowers rose like a confession. She stood among them, Miss Eliza Harrow, neither bride nor widow yet already spoken of as if her fate were sealed, her gloved hands folded with a composure learned too young. The pew behind her breathed whispers. The pew before her smiled with pity. All around, the city rehearsed her future aloud. They said the Duke would not come. They said he would come only to humiliate. They said he was late to everything except ruin. Eliza kept her gaze upon the carved angels above the altar, their stone mouths parted in eternal astonishment. She had heard the rumors before she entered the church, and she would hear them again before she left, but there was a discipline in listening without flinching. Her mother's absence pressed against her ribs, her father's debts pressed harder still. Marriage had become a remedy administered without consent, and the name prescribed was a bitter one. The Duke of Ravenshollow. A title spoken with relish as if cruelty were a spice. The first bell tolled. A hush followed, thin as ice. Eliza felt the weight of eyes settle upon her profile, measuring the curve of her cheek as one measures a thing to be sacrificed. She was not beautiful in the manner of the season. Her hair was too dark, her mouth too quiet. She had learned to move through rooms like a thought half finished, careful not to disturb the air. It was this quality, she suspected, that made her suitable. The world prefers its victims to be decorous. When the second bell rang, the door did not open. A murmur rose and ebbed. Someone laughed, quickly stifled. Eliza breathed in, then out, counting the seconds between heartbeats. She thought of the letters that had arrived in a hand both elegant and spare, letters that spoke of arrangements and obligations, never of feeling. She thought of the servants' stories, of a house where doors closed without sound and tempers cooled into frost. She thought of the Duke as the city described him, a man carved from severity, with eyes that saw too much and forgave nothing. The third bell struck, and at last the doors moved. Not flung wide, not dramatic, but opened with a careful inevitability. The Duke entered as one might step into a courtroom, unhurried and exact. He did not look about for approval. He did not bow to the whispers. His coat was dark, his bearing spare, his face composed into a mask that seemed less cruel than tired. Eliza felt the room tilt, as if a picture long hung crooked had been set straight. He paused, not to claim attention, but to take measure of the space, and then his gaze traveled forward. It found her without spectacle. There was no flare of recognition, no softness she could name. Yet the moment held. She had expected to feel small, but instead she felt seen in a way that was oddly impersonal, like a landscape surveyed for weather. The Duke inclined his head to the officiant and took his place. The ceremony proceeded with the precision of a ritual older than either of them, words falling into their places like coins into a bowl. Eliza spoke when spoken to. She did not tremble. She wondered if endurance could pass for courage. When it was done, the congregation released its breath and began again to murmur. The Duke did not offer his arm. He did not turn toward her. He allowed the pause to exist, a silence long enough to sting. Eliza lowered her eyes, prepared for the lesson to be taught in public. Then, without flourish, he stepped closer, not touching, not claiming, and addressed the officiant in a voice so even it startled. The marriage settlement, he said, would be honored in full. Any debts attached to the Harrow estate were his to resolve. There would be no further discussion. The words were plain, but they fell like a gavel. The murmurs broke into a startled quiet. Eliza lifted her gaze despite herself. The Duke had turned then, not to the room but to her, and for the briefest moment his restraint thinned. There was no smile. There was something else, a gravity that suggested care taken too late. He spoke again, lower now, meant only for her. "You have borne enough," he said, and the simplicity of it undid her more thoroughly than kindness ever had. She felt the shift within herself as surely as she felt the wheels begin to turn. Shame had been the language spoken to her all morning. Now another dialect intruded, hesitant and unfamiliar. It was not trust, not yet, but the absence of immediate dread. Through the carriage window, the city blurred into slate and silver, and she wondered what histories had taught him restraint, what wounds had schooled his voice into calm. The question lingered, bright and dangerous, like a match struck but unspent, promising warmth or ruin with equal breathless certainty for her. They left the church amid a rain that had softened into mist. The crowd parted with reluctance, like a curtain drawn against its will. At the foot of the steps, A carriage waited, black and immaculate, its door open as if an invitation rather than command. Eliza hesitated, her breath caught between habit and impulse. The Duke stood aside, giving her the space to choose. In that small courtesy the city's story faltered. She stepped forward, and as the carriage door closed behind them, she understood that the man the world condemned had just begun to reveal himself. The house at Ravenshollow did not announce itself with grandeur so much as certainty. Its stone facade rose from the damp earth like a judgment long rendered, ivy clinging to its walls as if even nature hesitated to let go. Eliza crossed its threshold with measured steps, her pulse loud in her ears, every sound magnified by unfamiliar ceilings and watchful corridors. Servants moved with disciplined quiet, their eyes lowered not in disdain but in habit, as though the house itself required restraint. The Duke did not escort her beyond the entrance. He entrusted her instead to custom, and that absence spoke as clearly as presence might have done. In the days that followed, Ravenshollow revealed itself in fragments. Mornings arrived veiled in fog that pressed against tall windows like an uninvited guest. Afternoons stretched long and hushed, broken only by the distant ticking of clocks and the echo of footsteps she could not place. Eliza learned the shape of the silence, learned where it deepened and where it thinned. She dined alone more often than not, her place at the table set with impeccable care, as if precision were a form of courtesy. The Duke appeared and disappeared according to no schedule she could discern, his movements as deliberate as his words had been few. Society did not grant her the mercy of distance. Letters arrived daily, their scripts elegant, their sentiments barbed. Some expressed concern cloaked in politeness, others curiosity barely disguised. They spoke of the Duke's history with a fascination that bordered on appetite. They warned her of cold tempers and colder rooms, of a man who punished disobedience with silence and loyalty with neglect. Eliza read each letter once, then burned it in the hearth, watching ink curl into ash. She would not allow their voices to colonize her thoughts, not when the house itself already pressed so closely around her. It was on the 7th evening that the first token appeared. She returned to her chamber to find a book resting upon the small writing desk, its leather binding worn smooth by use. There was no note, no crest, no claim. When she opened it, she found marginalia penned in a steady hand, observations thoughtful rather than showy. Passages concerning endurance were marked, reflections on mercy underlined with care. Eliza closed the book slowly, her breath unsteady. The gesture unsettled her more than any overt kindness might have done, for it suggested attention without demand. The servants said nothing. They did not speculate. They did not smile. The house absorbed the incident and continued, but Eliza felt its presence like a held breath. She read late into the night, the firelight gilding the page edges, and wondered how long the Duke had owned the book, what compelled him to relinquish it. When sleep came, it did so reluctantly, and her dreams were filled with corridors that led not to doors but to questions. The following afternoon brought rain and with it scandal. A distant cousin arrived unannounced, her concern sharp as vinegar. She spoke of tongues wagging in town, of rumors already taking shape. A gift left unchaperoned, the cousin implied, could be read as intimacy or worse, manipulation. Eliza listened without interruption, her hands folded in her lap. When the woman departed, satisfied she had done her duty, Eliza remained seated long after the sound of carriage wheels faded. The book waited upstairs, mute and accusatory. That evening, a shawl appeared, folded with meticulous care upon the back of a chair in the east gallery, where the windows admitted a treacherous draught. It was wool, soft and practical, dyed a restrained shade of blue that recalled clear mornings. Eliza touched it with tentative fingers, then drew it around her shoulders. The warmth was immediate, undeniable. She did not need to ask who had placed it there. The house, which had seemed so resolutely impersonal, now bore the faint impression of intent. The rumors grew bolder. Invitations arrived addressed to her alone, edged with curiosity and thinly veiled challenge. At one such gathering, she entered a drawing-room thick with perfume and expectation. Conversation faltered, then resumed at a pitch just low enough to wound. Someone mentioned the Duke's generosity with a smile that cut. Someone else wondered aloud what price such generosity required. Eliza felt the familiar heat of humiliation rise, but she held herself still, her spine straight, her voice calm when it was required of her. It was then that the Duke intervened. Not with spectacle, not with rebuke, but with a simple statement delivered from the doorway, his presence commanding attention by virtue of restraint. He thanked their hostess for her hospitality and announced that his wife was indisposed. There would be no further discussion. The words were neither loud nor threatening, yet they fell with such finality that the room rearranged itself around them. Eliza felt the shift like a loosening knot. On the carriage ride home, silence reigned once more, but it was altered, threaded with awareness. Eliza watched the city pass, its gas lamps blurring into constellations against the rain. She sensed the Duke beside her, his attention directed outward, his posture composed. She wondered if this too was a performance, another carefully measured act. Yet the book, the shawl, the quiet defense lingered in her mind, resistant to dismissal. That night she found a single camellia placed upon her pillow, its white petals unblemished, its stem freshly cut. No card accompanied it. Eliza sat upon the edge of the bed, the flower cupped in her hands, and felt the conflict sharpen within her. The world insisted upon one story, the house suggested another, and the man himself remained an enigma poised between them. As she extinguished the lamp, she understood that these tokens were not mere courtesies, but challenges, asking her to choose what she would believe, and how much of herself she was willing to risk in answering. The library at Ravenshollow revealed itself only at dusk, when the house seemed to exhale and permit its deeper rooms to be known. Eliza entered by accident, following the quiet logic of light, a single lamp burning beyond a half-closed door. Shelves rose to the ceiling, dark with age, their spines dulled by time and use. The air carried the scent of leather, dust, and something faintly resinous, like pine remembered from a distant season. She paused just inside, unsure whether she had trespassed upon a private sanctum, yet unwilling to retreat from the calm that settled upon her shoulders. The Duke stood at the far table, his back to her, one hand braced against the wood as he read. He had removed his coat, his shirt sleeves rolled with a care that suggested habit rather than haste. In the lamplight his profile softened, the severity she had come to associate with him yielding to concentration. Eliza felt the urge to withdraw, to preserve the illusion that this house existed in compartments she need not breach. But the floor betrayed her with a soft complaint, and he turned. He did not startle. He inclined his head, acknowledging her presence as one might acknowledge a fact long anticipated. "You may stay," he said before she could speak. The permission surprised her more than the tone, which was measured, devoid of command. She advanced a few steps, her hands clasped, her eyes tracing the orderly chaos of the room. This was not a space curated for display, it was lived in, argued with, returned to. "I did not intend to intrude," she said, her voice low, aware of how sound traveled here. "You do not," he replied. He gestured to a chair opposite him, the invitation restrained but unmistakable. Eliza sat, the leather cool beneath her palms. For a moment neither spoke. The silence was not oppressive but expectant, like a held note. "You have been given cause to doubt me," the Duke said at last. He did not meet her gaze as he spoke, choosing instead to align the edges of a stack of papers. "I will not pretend otherwise." Eliza felt the words settle, not as an accusation but as an offering. "The world is generous with its causes," she answered carefully. A faint acknowledgment crossed his features. "It is generous with cruelty as well." He looked up then, his eyes steady. "I have permitted that generosity. It has been easier." "Easier than correction?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness. "Easier than explanation," he said. "And far easier than confession." The word lingered between them, weighted with implication. Eliza drew a breath, the library seeming to contract around them. She thought of the tokens, the quiet defenses, the book with its thoughtful marks. "Why me?" she asked. "If your silence serves you so well, why disrupt it?" He considered her not as a strategist might, but as one weighing honesty against habit. "Because you endured what others would not," he said. "And because you did so without spectacle." His gaze held hers now, unflinching. "I recognized restraint when I saw it." Eliza felt a heat rise, not of embarrassment but recognition. She had worn her composure like armor, never imagining it might be read as strength. "Restraint can be mistaken for acquiescence," she said. "I know," he replied quietly. "It has been my own failing." He moved then, rounding the table with deliberate steps, stopping at a respectful distance. The lamplight carved shadows along his features, deepening the lines at his eyes. "I will not ask for your trust," he said. "I have done nothing to earn it. But I will offer you the truth such as it is." She nodded once. "My reputation was not born whole," he continued. "It was assembled, piece, by my own refusals. I lost someone under circumstances I could neither forgive nor publicly name. In choosing silence, I allowed others to speak for me. In time their voices grew louder than my own. "Why remain silent?" Eliza asked. "Because anger can be useful," he said. "It repels inquiry. It protects what remains." His mouth tightened briefly. "I did not expect to marry. When the arrangement was proposed, I intended only to settle accounts. Then I saw you endure what I had avoided, and the calculation failed." The admission landed with quiet force. Eliza searched his face for manipulation and found none, only a weariness that suggested long practice in solitude. "The gifts," she said. "The book." "A test," he said without evasion. "Not of you but of myself. To see whether I could offer without claiming." She absorbed this, the conflict within her sharpening. She had learned caution as a language, mistrust as a reflex. Yet here in this room something altered. Not certainty but possibility. "You need not answer me tonight," he said, stepping back, restoring the distance. "Or ever. I will not pursue what is not freely given." The restraint in his words unsettled her more than any demand. She rose, her heart unsteady. At the door she turned. "I am not accustomed to being asked," she said. "Only told." His gaze softened infinitesimally. "Then consider this a beginning," he said. As she left the library, the lamplight dimming behind her, Eliza felt the axis of her understanding shift. The man she had married was neither the monster of rumor nor the savior of imagination, but something more dangerous still, a truth unfinished, waiting for her to decide whether she would step closer, or protect herself by retreating into the story the world had already written for them both. The morning of the wedding arrived without mercy, pale and exacting, as though dawn itself intended to witness every hesitation. Bells rang across the valley, their sound carried on cold air that sharpened breath and resolve alike. Ravenshollow stirred beneath a sky scrubbed clean of tenderness, servants moving with ceremonial precision through corridors scented with beeswax and rosewater. Eliza stood before the mirror, her gown heavy in her hands, feeling the gravity of its promise. Marriage had ceased to be an abstraction. It pressed against her ribs, insistent, irreversible, demanding courage she was not certain she possessed. She descended the staircase alone, each step measured, each breath restrained, her reflection fragmenting in tall mirrors that offered no comfort. At the threshold of the great hall, voices softened, then ceased entirely, as though the house itself recognized the solemnity of what was unfolding. Guests had gathered in muted splendor, their silks whispering, their glances sharp with expectation. Eliza felt herself assessed not as a woman but as a conclusion already drawn. The Duke had not yet appeared, and the absence tightened around her like a held note, stretching patience and fear in equal measure. When he entered, there was no announcement. The room adjusted instinctively, attention bending toward him as iron bends toward a magnet. He wore formality without ornament, his presence composed, his expression unreadable. Eliza watched him from the corner of her vision, aware of the distance between them and of the many eyes that interpreted that distance as indictment. He did not look at her immediately. Instead, he acknowledged the gathered company with a brief inclination of his head, a gesture that suggested control rather than welcome. The ceremony proceeded with deliberate gravity. Words ancient and binding filled the space, spoken by others, claimed by them both. Eliza's voice did not falter when her turn came, though her pulse betrayed her. She sensed the Duke beside her, steady, restrained, offering neither reassurance nor threat. It was only when the vows concluded that he turned fully toward her. His gaze held no triumph, no indulgence. It held intent, clear and unembellished, as though this moment demanded truth stripped of spectacle. Afterward, as tradition required, they stood together before the assembly. A murmur rose, anticipating some declaration, some display that would confirm every rumor. The Duke did not oblige. Instead, he took Eliza's hand, not possessively, but with a formality that carried weight. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and carried without effort. He thanked those present for witnessing the union and stated plainly that his wife would not be subject to conjecture or commentary. Any who found that expectation burdensome were free to depart his house and his regard. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Silence fell, sharp and stunned. Eliza felt the shift ripple through the room, a recalibration of power she had never expected to witness on her behalf. She did not look at the guest. She looked at him. The grip of his hand remained steady, neither tightening nor releasing, as if he understood the delicacy of what he offered. In that moment, dignity returned to her like a forgotten inheritance. The reception unfolded with careful restraint. Conversations resumed, but their edges had dulled. Eliza moved through the hall with the Duke at her side, aware of the way space opened before them. He spoke when required, listened more than he spoke, and never left her exposed to scrutiny. When a remark edged too close to insult, he redirected it with precision, never raising his voice, never explaining himself. Eliza felt the constant tension within her begin to loosen, replaced by an unfamiliar steadiness. As evening gathered, they withdrew from the company, not abruptly but with purpose. The corridors beyond the hall welcomed them with shadow and quiet, candle flames bowing as they passed. Eliza became acutely aware of the finality of each step, of the threshold approaching that would separate public performance from private truth. She wondered whether the composure he displayed before others would endure when the door closed behind them. Outside the chamber he paused. The moment stretched, intimate and charged, filled with everything unspoken. He released her hand at last and turned to face her fully. "What I did today," he said, his voice low, "was not obligation." He searched her face as though weighing the cost of the next words. It was choice. Eliza felt the weight of that admission settle deep within her, unsettling and clarifying all at once. She nodded, unable yet to answer. He opened the door then, standing aside to let her enter first, granting her precedence where none had been required. As she crossed the threshold, heart racing, she understood that the true test of him had not yet begun, and that whatever waited within the quiet of that room would demand more courage than silence ever had. The chamber received them with a hush so complete it felt earned, candlelight pooling softly along the walls and gilding the heavy curtains drawn against the night. Eliza stood just inside the door, aware of every rustle of silk, every measured breath, the world beyond reduced to memory. This room, long anticipated and much discussed by others, belonged now to no audience but themselves. She waited for instruction, for expectation to assert itself, yet none came. The Duke remained near the threshold as though unwilling to crowd her, his restraint palpable and strangely reverent. In that pause, possibility trembled quietly. He closed the door with deliberate gentleness, the sound final without being cruel, and turned to face her. For a moment he said nothing, allowing the silence to settle without command. Eliza sensed the weight of years in his stillness, histories disciplined into composure. He removed his gloves slowly, setting them aside as one might set down armor, and at last met her gaze. There was no hunger there, only resolve tempered by care, a man choosing patience over presumption despite the rights that bound them. The choice altered the air between them, making her breathe easier than expected tonight. "You need not fear me," he said at last, his voice low, stripped of ceremony, carrying no claim. The words did not plead, they waited. Eliza felt them move through her like cautious light, illuminating corners she had kept sealed. She studied his face, noting the careful distance he maintained, the way he stood as though granting her dominion even here. Fear had been her inheritance, but choice, she realized, might yet be learned, if offered without force. The possibility frightened her precisely because it was gentle, and therefore required her courage, not obedience, for the first time tonight alone. He nodded once, accepting her silence as answer enough, and moved to the window, drawing back the curtain just enough to admit moonlight. The silver glow softened the room, dissolving its severity into something almost kind. "I have waited," he said, not turning, the confession released into shadow. Not for this night as others might assume, but for permission. The word resonated, startling in its humility, reshaping everything she had been taught to expect from power. Eliza felt the past loosen its grip upon her. Slowly, carefully, she stepped closer, each movement a quiet act of trust, hard-won tonight. She stopped within reach yet untouched, aware that this nearness was chosen, not taken. "I have been afraid," she said, the truth unadorned, her voice steady despite the admission. "Of you, of myself, of believing what the world denies." He turned then, and in his eyes she found no triumph, only relief, as though her honesty eased a burden long carried alone. The space between them held not tension now, but invitation, fragile and fiercely respected. He lifted his hand, then let it fall, allowing her the final, decisive step. She took it, heart hammering, resolute in newly claimed peace. Their foreheads touched, a communion so restrained it felt sacred, breaths mingling, the world narrowing to shared warmth. He spoke then, a whisper shaped by reverence rather than need. "I have been waiting for you to choose me," he said, each word deliberate. The confession landed softly yet irrevocably, sealing something neither law nor ceremony could command. Eliza closed her eyes, understanding at last that his silence had never been absence, but vigilance, guarding a devotion too careful to announce itself. Tears gathered, not from sorrow but release. She did not pull away nor did he press. Time seemed suspended. Later, as candles burned lower, they spoke little, letting presence replace explanation. The Duke moved with careful courtesy as though relearning closeness by degrees, and Eliza found herself mirroring his patience. In the quiet, she sensed the enormity of what had shifted. Fear yielding to trust, judgment to curiosity. Yet beyond the walls, society remained unchanged, its verdicts waiting like weather. Love, she understood, would not silence them all, but it could build shelter enough to endure. The thought steadied her more than any vow. She wondered what dawn would demand of them and whether courage would remain by morning. Sleep came unevenly, layered with awareness, until a faint light touched the curtains. Eliza stirred, disoriented, then remembered where she was and with whom. The Duke lay beside her, not claiming space, his expression softened by rest. She studied him without fear now, seeing not legend but man, shaped by loss and intention alike. Outside, the first birds tested their voices, indifferent to scandal, announcing a day that would require them to stand together. She reached for his hand and he woke. Their eyes met, unguarded, equal. Whatever awaited, they would answer it jointly with resolve earned in quiet hours. Ravenshollow stirred fully as morning claimed it, servants resuming patterns, the world pressing close once more. Eliza rose, feeling changed not by spectacle but by understanding. She knew whispers would resume, judgments sharpen, expectations return with force. Yet she also knew the man beside her would not retreat into silence again, nor would she accept erasure. They had crossed a threshold unseen, forged not by defiance alone, but by mutual choosing, and that knowledge armored her better than fear ever had. He watched her dress, saying nothing, honoring privacy. The restraint confirmed everything promised the night before without a word. As they prepared to re-enter the world, Eliza paused at the window, sunlight bright and unapologetic. She felt the weight of the Duke's presence behind her, steady as a vow. This story, she knew, would not end in easy absolution. The world rarely relinquished its condemnations. But within that knowledge bloomed resolve, fierce and luminous. She turned to him, ready to face what waited beyond the door, knowing love had been spoken in whispers, and that such truths endure longest. He reached for her hand, their alliance unspoken. Together they stepped forward, no longer alone, whatever judgment dared follow them. The dawn broke slowly over Ravenshollow, spilling pale gold across slate roofs and damp gardens, yet the house remained in an almost reverent hush. Eliza stood by the tall windows of her chamber, her hands resting lightly on the sill as she watched the mist curl around the ivy-clad walls. The night's quiet intimacies had left their residue upon her, an awareness that life had changed not through ceremony, but through choice and unspoken understanding. Her reflection in the glass was pale and composed, yet beneath the surface, a storm of anticipation and trepidation churned. Today demanded courage of a different sort, the kind that met the outside world armed with conviction rather than mere endurance. The Duke entered without announcement, moving across the room with a measured quiet that both startled and reassured her. He did not offer words at first. Instead, he observed her, noting the subtle shift in posture, the slight tension in her shoulders that had not been there last night. He removed his gloves with deliberate care, placing them upon the table as though surrendering them, not as a gesture of formality, but as a symbol of presence. His eyes, steel-gray yet softened in this rare intimacy, followed her with scrutiny tempered by respect. Eliza met his gaze without flinching, though her pulse raced. She understood that the trials of the day would not be borne by him alone. They were to be borne together. Breakfast was silent save for the occasional clink of porcelain. The Duke's hand hovered near hers on the table, a subtle anchor against the tides of expectation. Outside, Ravenshollow's gardens lay wet and gleaming, the mist curling around manicured hedges and ornate fountains. Their eyes met again and again across the table, and in those glances, no words were necessary. They had discovered a language of restraint and invitation, of consent and quiet acknowledgement, that neither the world nor its gossip could replicate. The first visitor arrived mid-morning, a distant relative, officious and eager, carrying the thinly veiled judgment of town and society. She greeted Eliza with a smile that did not reach her eyes, speaking in the tones of instruction rather than inquiry. "You will find your new life requires adaptation," she said, glancing subtly toward the Duke as though to confirm his complicity in some imagined cruelty. Eliza responded with calm courtesy, her tone polite, measured, yet beneath it lay the steel of self-possession. The Duke, standing silently behind her, did not intervene immediately. Instead, he allowed her composure to speak for itself, a statement more formidable than any defense. Later, in the long gallery, a series of minor scandals attempted to unsettle her. Letters arrived with suggestions of impropriety, subtle insinuations intended to test her poise. She read each one with a practiced neutrality before tossing them into the fire. The Duke followed her through the gallery, his presence quiet but undeniable, a shield forged of calm and observation. At times he would glance at her with a faint lift of his brow, silently conveying acknowledgement, approval, or the faintest caution. It was not intimidation, it was partnership, and it strengthened her courage more than any speech could have done. By afternoon, the sky had cleared, leaving sunlight to stream into the long windows, illuminating tapestries and portraits of stern ancestors who seemed to judge as keenly as any visitor. Eliza walked beside the Duke through the drawing room, the sensation of their proximity neither oppressive nor casual. Each gesture, each glance, was an exercise in negotiation and trust. For the first time she felt the weight of her circumstances as a choice rather than an obligation, a realization that fear did not define her, nor did his reputation dictate the terms of their union. Their interactions had become a delicate choreography of mutual understanding, subtle, deliberate, and electric with unspoken possibility. When evening arrived, it brought with it a visitor of a different kind, a messenger from a neighboring estate, bearing news that could have unsettled their fragile peace. A financial dispute, a rumor meant to inflame, and a threat of social scrutiny arrived in careful, scripted prose. Eliza received the papers and read them silently, her expression composed, yet the Duke's hand rested lightly on hers, a reassurance more potent than any declaration. He spoke softly, not to belittle the matter, but to align their strategy and understanding. "The world will test us," he said, "but we are no longer unarmed." His voice carried authority not over her, but beside her, and she understood the depth of the bond they had forged in private hours. Night fell like a heavy curtain, bringing with it the final test of the day. A gathering was announced in the drawing room, a social engagement designed to display their union before scrutiny, and Eliza faced the assembly with a grace that surprised even herself. Each guest's eyes searched for evidence of discord, for the faintest misstep to report upon. The Duke stood beside her, silent, steady, his presence a quiet proclamation that she did not stand alone. Murmurs of judgment arose, then faltered, dissipating under the weight of their composure. Eliza realized in that moment that power could exist not in assertion, but in serene confidence, and that the partnership she shared with the Duke made her formidable in a way that rumor never could. As the evening deepened, conversation eased, the tension of expectation yielding to the calm assurance they projected. It was then, in the half-light of the gallery, that the Duke stepped closer, closing a space that had been deliberate until now. He did not touch her, but his presence pressed gently against the quiet around them, a force of intention. "I have spoken little of my regard," he said, his voice low and intimate, "because it could only mean something if you understood its measure for yourself." His gaze held hers with an intensity tempered by patience, a look that demanded acknowledgement without force. Eliza's heart stirred, the last of her fear dissolving into awareness. She moved closer, drawn not by necessity, but by a recognition of truth, of intention, of the rare human constancy she had longed to find. "I see it," she whispered, voice firm with emotion. "I see you and what has been withheld from the world." The admission hung between them, unembellished, profound, and irrevocable. He inclined his head, a gesture neither of triumph nor surrender, but of shared understanding. It was a covenant written in absence of ceremony, a promise forged in quiet intensity. Then, at the apex of tension, a sudden sound broke the spell, a carriage arriving unexpectedly, wheels clattering across gravel, voices carrying in the cool night air. The Duke's expression darkened with awareness, not fear but calculation. He moved swiftly yet unobtrusively toward the window, evaluating, discerning, protective. Eliza stood beside him, their shoulders brushing lightly, a silent testament to the unspoken alliance that had taken root between them. The outside world pressed against their sanctuary, eager to intrude, to expose, to unravel, yet they met it together, eyes aligned, resolve shared. The carriage stopped, and a figure alighted, cloaked in shadow, their identity concealed yet unmistakably deliberate. The house seemed to inhale in anticipation, the candles flickering as though sensing the challenge at hand. The Duke's hand found Eliza's and she gripped it firmly, not in fear but in partnership. He whispered her name, a gentle acknowledgement of trust and readiness. "We face this together," he said, and she nodded, understanding that whatever followed, they were no longer defined by rumor, fear, or obligation. They were defined by choice. As the door opened to the visitor, revealing a face familiar yet loaded with intent, Eliza felt the culmination of all trials. The judgment of society, the scrutiny of peers, the weight of expectation, condense into this singular instant. The Duke's gaze met hers, unwavering, and she returned it with clarity and courage. In that shared look lay a quiet but unassailable truth. The past and the world's condemnations held no dominion over them, for they had chosen each other, and that choice was an act of defiance, intimacy, and irrevocable commitment. The night hung poised between revelation and confrontation, the house alive with anticipation, candlelight dancing across walls and faces. Outside, the mist swirled, the carriage waiting, the night holding its breath. Inside, two figures stood resolute, bound by trust, patience, and a nascent understanding of love's delicate power. And in that moment, the narrative suspended itself, a precipice of choice and courage, hinting at storms yet to come but promising that whatever the world demanded, they would meet it together, unshaken and ready. The final realization settled in Eliza's chest like warm iron. She had not merely survived her entry into the Duke's world. She had stepped fully into her own. She looked up at him, gray eyes steady, and whispered, "Let them come." The Duke smiled faintly, an expression of relief, pride, and love restrained but unmistakable. They moved together toward the door, shoulders squared, hands entwined, the promise between them as tangible as the candlelight flickering across the walls. Outside, the world awaited judgment. Inside, a new chapter had begun, forged not by fear but by choice, trust, and the quiet revelation that even the most feared of men could harbor a soul worth embracing.